October 24th, 2021, at 3:15 p.m., a 15-year-old boy called 911 to report he and his two younger brothers, ages 7 and 10, had been living alone at an apartment at City Park 2 at West Oaks in Houston, Texas. During the 911 call, the boy would shockingly tell the operator that one of his brothers was dead in the next room and had been in there for about a year. He also said his parents had moved out of the apartment months ago, leaving them behind to fend for themselves. The brother that had been dead for a year was only 8 years old, and his body had been left in a room in the apartment the entire time. When Harris County Sheriff's deputies showed up, they found 3 children alone and abandoned inside the third-floor apartment, along with their other brother's skeletal remains. The 7, 10, and 15-year-old boys were then taken to a nearby hospital and appeared malnourished and showed signs of physical injury, with the 10-year-old having sustained a serious jaw injury from a beating he received from his mother's boyfriend. Because the 10-year-old did not receive medical treatment after he was punched in the jaw, surgery was required. Protective Services then received emergency custody of the boys and placed them into foster care. They had not been in school since May of 2020 and had survived off food that their mother would bring to them once or twice a month, and also from food they were getting from their neighbors. Apparently, the neighbors had no clue the children were abandoned and taking care of themselves. Harris County Sheriff Ed Gonzalez described the scene as too horrific to even be real. He said the children were living in deplorable conditions, and it appeared they had been fending for themselves for quite some time. He said the carpet inside was soiled, there was no furniture, and the children didn't even have blankets or beds. The apartment was also infested with flies and cockroaches, and there is evidence the children were at some point locked in different parts of the apartment. Their mother, 35-year-old Gloria Williams, and her boyfriend, 32-year-old Brian Coulter, were brought in for questioning that evening and then released without charges so police could process evidence before charges were filed. They were then arrested 2 days later on October 26, 2021, at a public library where they were searching news articles about themselves. Her boyfriend, 32-year-old Brian Coulter, was charged with the killing of 8-year-old Kendrick Lee. Williams was charged with altering, destroying, and the concealing of Kendrick's body. When Williams was asked why she left the kids alone, she responded, "I checked on them every 2 weeks." Melody Robinson, one of the children's paternal grandmothers, said Williams has a total of 6 kids, ranging from 7 to 17, and was not a fit mother and has been very unstable. Williams and Melody's son would have a daughter together, and from the time she was 2 weeks old, Melody has had custody. Melody said she had no idea Kendrick was dead and the children were abandoned. She said the last time she saw Williams was in November of 2020 when another of Williams' children, a 17-year-old girl, wanted to come live with her because of Williams' boyfriend's behavior. The girl said she was tired of seeing him abuse her siblings, and when she stepped in to try to protect them, her mother put her out. Investigators say Williams failed to protect them or get them help despite her boyfriend allegedly beating one of them to death and continued abuse of the others. As for the children found in the apartment, an investigator said it appears that at least 2 of them have different fathers. Investigators believe one father is deceased and the other is not in the picture and has no contact with his children. A detective described the boys as special needs children, noting that early information indicates that at least 2 of the boys have autism. Tragically, 2 of the boys witnessed their brother's murder and were able to describe it in detail. They said the beating continued even after their brother had stopped blinking his eyes. When their mother came into the room, she saw the body on the floor, began crying, and made the children leave while she fought with Coulter. Williams said that when she confronted Coulter, he told her he was sorry and that he lost it, and had continued punching the child until he went to sleep. She told investigators she did not notify law enforcement of the boy's death because Coulter had told her not to, and that she was afraid the 3 other children would be taken by Child Protective Services. She also said she worried she would go to jail. Kendrick's death was ruled a homicide and said the manner of death was from multiple blunt force injuries. Investigators believe his death occurred shortly before Thanksgiving 2020, and that 5 to 6 months later is when Williams and Coulter abandoned the apartment. The pair then moved into another apartment 25 minutes away, and Williams would occasionally show back up to deliver food. When Coulter's charges were read in court, he was not present because he was being evaluated at a mental health unit. Williams was charged with injury to a child by omission and tampering with evidence, namely a human corpse. The judge set his bond at $1 million and Williams' bond at $900,000. According to the Harris County Sheriff, they both could face more charges or the charges could be upgraded. As of today, this case remains an active investigation. When Andre Carmichael was a young boy living in Brooklyn, New York, his aunt asked him about his twin sister, Latanisha. However, Andre had no recollection of a twin sister and was very confused. When he asked his mother, Madeline Carmichael, about it, she and her other son, Andre's older brother, Gregory Carmichael, would punish him with physical abuse. This was a regular occurrence in the household, and they would generally punish him with anything they could get their hands on. In 1988, Madeline and Gregory went to Andre's junior high school, strip searched him, and physically abused him because they thought he had stolen the rent money. Andre would then be placed in foster care. His older sister, Sabrina, had also been placed in foster care 6 months earlier than he was. While in foster care, they would have very little contact with their mother. Years later, in 1995, Andre asked Sabrina about his twin sister, but she wouldn't tell him the truth. 4 years later, in 1999, Andre took his daughter and stepdaughter to meet with his mother. Andre thought it was strange that Madeline ignored her own granddaughter and instead doted only on his stepdaughter. As they were leaving, Madeline asked him not to bring his daughter back to her house. He later said he believed his daughter reminded her of her own daughter, Andre's twin sister. Andre then contacted his sister Sabrina and told her that he was thinking of hiring a private investigator to find out about his twin sister. Sabrina finally told him he did have a twin sister named Latanisha that was killed at the age of 3. She said in 1979, when she was 9 years old and the twins were 3, she witnessed their mother and older brother beating their sister to death and then placing her in a closet, and that she was probably still there. However, Sabrina made Andre sign an agreement not to go to police. According to Andre, Sabrina feared their lives would be endangered if they told police about their family secret. She was afraid because she had also been physically abused when she was younger if she mentioned Latanisha. When Andre was older and again asked his mother about his twin sister, she told him that she had 4 children at the time and couldn't afford to keep all of them, so she had to send one down south. She said that their father left her not long after the twins were born and she was very poor. Throughout the years, anytime Madeline was asked about Latanisha, she would say that she was in foster care or living down south. Andre tore up the written agreement he had made with Sabrina, broke the promise, and contacted the police. Weeks later, on November 5, 1999, police arrived at the apartment of Madeline Carmichael at 96 Rockaway Parkway in Brooklyn, New York. They had a search warrant, but they weren't prepared for the gruesome discovery they would find. Police said the apartment reeked of mothballs, and they noticed behind some furniture the door of a closet that had been bolted and painted over many times. When it was pried open, it was full of old air fresheners, incense, and boxes of baking soda. There they would find a trunk wrapped in cellophane. As they struggled to pry it open, Madeline waited in the other room, very agitated and upset. When they were finally able to open its door, they found the mummified body of a little girl wrapped in more layers of cellophane, a blanket, and newspapers dating back to November 4, 1979. Madeline then pretended to have a seizure, was given oxygen, and taken by ambulance to Kings County Hospital. The officers found Latanisha's birth certificate and social security card in the apartment, but there were no photos of her. Prosecutors say Latanisha's mother and 17-year-old brother Gregory beat her to death after she vomited from being forced to eat, then tried to cover it up. Sabrina recalled her mother attempting to resuscitate Latanisha without success. Her body was then wrapped up and hidden for 20 years. Investigators said child welfare workers first contacted the family in 1982, but even though they knew Latanisha was no longer living with her mom, they made no effort to track her down. A neighbor said most of the time, Madeline was very nice, respectful, and never bothered anyone. For a long time leading up to the discovery, Madeline had been complaining to the building superintendent about hearing babies crying in the middle of the night, keeping her awake, although there were no children in the apartments above or below hers. Andre and Sabrina believed that her own child was haunting her or she was losing her mind. Gregory was interviewed by police about Latanisha's death while serving time in prison for robbery, and finally in October 2000, both 61-year-old Madeline and 38-year-old Gregory were arrested. Gregory was later convicted of criminal negligent homicide and sentenced to 1 to 4 years in prison, and Madeline was sentenced to 15 years for second-degree murder. Latanisha's remains were cremated in 2002, and Madeline died in August of 2002. Andre has never seen a picture of his sister. He and Sabrina, along with Aurora Mackey, went on to write a book about their story called Family Skeleton, A Brother and Sister's Journey from Murder to Truth. Dorian Corey was a famous drag queen and fashion designer in the New York ball scene. She became well known after she appeared in Jenny Livingston's documentary, Paris is Burning. Filmed during the mid to late 1980s, the film interviews key figures in the New York ball culture, along with diving into an exploration of race, class, gender, and sexuality of America at the time. Sadly, 3 years after the movie's release on August 29, 1993, Corey died of AIDS-related complications at the age of 56. Her extensive costume collection was passed on to her friend and caregiver, Lois Taylor. A couple months after she passed away, Taylor and a couple others went to Corey's fifth-floor apartment in Harlem to look into her expansive wardrobe. That's when they came across a heavy trunk, and inside was a green plaid garment bag. They were unable to find a zipper, and the bag was too heavy to lift, so Lois cut the bag open with some scissors. That's when a horrible stench was released, causing Taylor to immediately step away and call the police. The police would find a partially mummified body curled into a fetal position with a bullet hole in the head. The corpse was wrapped in fake leather and plastic bags. When the body was unwrapped, several pull tabs from old flip-top beer cans fell out. Police were able to identify the body as Robert Bobby Worley, who had been incarcerated in 1963 for rape and assault. Worley is also referred to as Robert Wales. He was estranged from his family, and they had last seen him in 1968. The vintage beer can lids came from the 1960s and 70s, suggesting that he had been dead for possibly 25 years. But no one who had socialized or lived with Corey during that time ever recalled her mentioning Worley, let alone confessing to killing him. Some of Corey's fellow drag queens speculated that Corey had shot Worley during a failed robbery. Worley's brother Fred claimed that Worley was a raging alcoholic and had called him once while drunk, rambling about someone named Dorian and having apparently fought with her. Strangely, Corey had written a short story about a transgender woman who killed her lover in revenge after he pressured her to have a sex change. Investigators speculate that Corey may have shot him in self-defense during a lover's quarrel, or that he may have been shot during an attempted burglary. Friends of Corey's speculate that there was no romantic relationship and that Corey shot Worley when he broke into her apartment and covered up the crime because she knew the police wouldn't give her a fair shake. However, without any kind of first-hand testimony from either Corey or Worley, it seems that the mystery of how he died and how he ended up in her closet will never be solved. In 1999, renovations were being done at an apartment building in the 800 block of Buckingham Place in Chicago, Illinois. During the renovations, Larry Vincent was digging a garden outside of the apartment between two buildings. That is when he found a plastic bag and saw what looked like old clothing inside of it. His next discovery horrified him because as he tapped the bag, a skull came rolling out. Along with the skull, other bones were found that belonged to an unidentified child. When the child was buried, they had pajamas on, and investigators were able to track down the manufacturer's date and what years they were sold. They were originally manufactured in 1968, and the product line would only last 1 year before being discontinued in 1969. DNA was used to show that the child was a girl who had been about 6 years old and had been buried between 1968 and 1969. It was determined that she had been murdered and the cause of death was listed as asphyxia. It was estimated that she had been struck in the head 4 weeks before she died. The actual cause of death was most likely due to someone pressing on her chest until she couldn't breathe. The actual details of her death are far too gruesome for this video, but the anthropologist did say in his 40 years of practice, he had never seen anything so brutal and cruel. Detectives returned to the neighborhood the skeleton was found and asked neighbors if they remembered anything unusual from over 30 years ago. That's when they spoke to 44-year-old Vera Rodriguez, who would lead them in the right direction of identifying the remains. In 1969, Vera was a child and said she often heard a little girl crying in pain in an apartment near her home. Vera was only 12 years old at that time, and when she would bring up the crying girl to her mother, she was told to mind her own business. Vera told the detectives that she could remember the girl being pushed in a toddler stroller and that she had 2 brothers as well as parents named John and Tom. She remembered cries echoing across the alley until one day when the crying stopped. The detectives began searching records, hoping to find the child's school registration. The Board of Education kept the registration cards on 3x5 index cards in storage boxes. They searched through about 50,000 cards, spanning a century of enrollment with no set order. 5 officers began working in shifts, looking for any child that lived in the 800 block of West Buckingham in the late 1960s. On the 4th day of searching, they got a hit. A card reading 843 West Buckingham, 1969, had a student's name of Scott Blake, whose parents were Tom and Joan. Police tracked down 37-year-old Scott Blake in San Antonio, Texas. They informed him a child's skeleton had been located buried near his former home, and they believed it was his older sister. But Scott had no knowledge of having a sister, though he did have some memories of always hearing someone crying when he was a child. Scott spent the next few days racking his brain for memories. That's when a memory popped up about the name Holly coming up in a heated argument between his parents when he was a child. Police subpoenaed Holly's birth records and found that she was born March 2, 1962. They then contacted Joan, who was then living in Nebraska, who at first denied ever having a daughter, though she did admit to having lived at the address. It was learned that Joan had kept her secret well hidden in the town she had lived in for more than 10 years after leaving Chicago. Joan lived alone, rarely spoke to anyone in town, and kept the ashes of a deceased boyfriend in her apartment. She would even have food and cigarettes delivered to her apartment, even though she was only a few blocks away from the food mart. As it turned out, Joan was in the hospital suffering from congestive heart failure, and her condition was getting worse. A detective decided to fly to Nebraska in hopes of getting some answers. The only responses Joan could give were to nod or shake her head, since she was on a ventilator. When asked if she caused the death of her daughter, Joan nodded that yes, she had. When asked if she had buried her daughter by the side of the house, Joan again nodded that yes, she had. When asked if her husband was involved in the death and burial, Joan shook her head to say no. Police were able to get DNA from Joan to establish if she was the mother of the child found, and DNA would confirm this. It was determined that the remains belonged to Holly Lee Blake, someone who few people even knew existed up to that point. Holly's life was very sad. She dealt with physical abuse and was very malnourished. Holly was kept in a locked room in the back of the apartment. She had never been enrolled in school, and it seemed she had never been to the doctor, as there were no records at all of her having visited one. Joan Miller died on a Friday in March of 2000 in her hospital room, 5 days after confessing to the murder of her own daughter. The case has been closed, though the police had not had the opportunity to ask her why Holly had died. Holly was survived by her 2 younger brothers, Scott and Kevin, who never even knew she existed. He recalled his mother as violent, cold, intense, and that his father was always intimidated by her. His father, Tom, died in 1987, so he took any knowledge of the murder to his grave. Holly's remains were cremated, and her ashes are kept by her younger brother, Scott.